What if I told you that in the winter of 1947, high in the Himalayan mountains of Tibet, a group of villagers discovered something that would haunt them for the rest of their lives? They found a man, completely encased in ice, his eyes wide open, his lips moving in silent prayer. But here's where it gets impossible to believe. 3 days later, when the ice finally melted, he simply stood up, brushed off his robes, and walked away as if he had just woken up from an afternoon nap. This is the story of Tenzin Norbu, the monk who defied death itself, and the terrifying secret that died with him in that frozen cave. A secret so disturbing that the few who witnessed it have never spoken of it again. Until now. The year was 1946, and Tibet was a land caught between worlds. The old ways were clashing with modern reality, and nowhere was this more apparent than in the remote monastery of Rongbuk, perched impossibly high on the slopes of Mount Everest. Here, 23 monks dedicated their lives to practices so extreme, so dangerous, that even other Tibetan monasteries whispered about them in hushed tones. Tenzin Norbu was not like the other monks. While his brothers meditated in the relative warmth of the monastery halls, Tenzin sought something darker. Something that required him to push his body to the very edge of human endurance. He practiced Tummo, the ancient art of inner fire meditation, but he had twisted it into something else entirely. Something unnatural. The other monks had noticed changes in Tenzin over the months leading up to that fateful winter. His skin had taken on an almost translucent quality, as if the blood beneath had grown cold and sluggish. His breathing had become so shallow that sometimes they couldn't tell if he was alive or dead during his meditations. Most disturbing of all were his eyes, which had developed a strange glassy quality that seemed to reflect light like ice crystals. But it was his obsession with cold that truly frightened them. While the other monks huddled around fires during the harsh Himalayan winter, Tenzin would strip naked and sit in the snow for hours, his body temperature so low that frost would form on his skin. Yet somehow, impossibly, he never seemed to suffer from frostbite or hypothermia. If anything, he appeared to grow stronger with each exposure to the killing cold. The head monk, Lobsang Tashi, had tried repeatedly to intervene. He sensed that Tenzin was walking a dangerous path, one that led away from enlightenment and toward something far more sinister. But Tenzin had become obsessed with what he called the final teaching, a practice he claimed would allow him to transcend the boundaries between life and death itself. On the night of December 1946, the winter solstice, and the longest night of the year, Tenzin announced his intention to undertake his ultimate test. He would seal himself inside a cave high on the mountain and remain there in deep meditation until the spring. The other monks were horrified. No human being could survive 3 months in those conditions without food, water, or warmth. It was suicide disguised as spiritual practice. But Tenzin was beyond reason. His eyes had taken on that terrible glassy quality permanently now, and when he spoke, his breath came out in visible puffs, even in the relatively warm monastery. Something fundamental had changed in his body, something that defied all medical understanding. He had become something that existed in the space between life and death, neither fully alive nor completely deceased. That night, as the wind howled across the mountain peaks like the voices of the dead, Tenzin made his way to a cave approximately 2,000 feet above the monastery. The other monks followed at a distance, watching in horror as their brother performed a ritual they had never seen before. He arranged stones in a specific pattern around the cave entrance, chanting in a language that sounded ancient beyond measure, older than Tibetan, older perhaps than human speech itself. Then he did something that froze the blood of every witness. He began to weep, but his tears were not water. They fell from his eyes like liquid crystal, freezing instantly as they touched his cheeks, creating a mask of ice across his face. And still, he continued his chanting, his voice growing louder and more inhuman with each passing moment. Finally, as the clock struck midnight, Tenzin entered the cave and sealed the entrance from inside, using a technique known only to him. The last thing the watching monks heard was his voice, echoing from within the mountain itself, reciting mantras in that terrifying ancient tongue. The winter that followed was the harshest in living memory. Temperatures plummeted to -40 degrees Fahrenheit, and the wind carried with it a sound that the villagers below described as weeping. Some claimed they could hear Tenzin's voice on the wind, still chanting, still calling out in that inhuman language. Others reported seeing a strange blue light emanating from the direction of his cave. A light that pulsed in rhythm with a heartbeat. But it was the dreams that truly terrified the local population. Night after night, people throughout the region reported the same nightmare. They would find themselves standing in an endless field of ice. And there, in the center, would be Tenzin. But he was no longer human. His skin had become transparent, as glacier ice, and through it, they could see his organs, frozen solid, yet somehow still functioning. His heart beat with the slow, steady rhythm of centuries, and his eyes had become windows into an Arctic hell that existed beyond the natural world. In these dreams, Tenzin would beckon to the dreamers, inviting them to join him in his frozen paradise. Some who experienced these visions reported waking up with frostbite on their extremities, despite sleeping in warm beds. Others found ice crystals in their hair and clothing, as if they had actually visited that terrible frozen realm. 3 months passed, and spring began its tentative arrival in the Himalayas. The monks had assumed that Tenzin was dead, that they would need to retrieve his frozen corpse when the cave entrance became accessible again. They prepared funeral rites and mourning ceremonies, accepting that their troubled brother had finally found peace in death. But on March 21st, the spring equinox, something impossible happened. A group of villagers climbing the mountain to collect early spring herbs heard a sound that stopped them in their tracks. It was chanting, the same inhuman chanting that had been heard on the wind all winter. But now, it was coming from inside the mountain itself, growing louder and more insistent. When they reached Tenzin's cave, they found that the sealed entrance had been broken open from within, and there, sitting in the lotus position exactly as he had been 3 months earlier, was Tenzin Norbu. He was encased in a solid block of ice, so thick and clear that he looked like a religious statue carved from crystal. But his eyes were open, staring directly at them, and his lips were still moving in that endless, less terrifying chant. The villagers fled in terror, but word spread quickly throughout the region. Within hours, a crowd had gathered, including several monks from Rongbuk Monastery. They stood at a safe distance, watching in fascination and horror as this impossible scene played out before them. Tenzin's body showed no signs of decay or damage. If anything, he appeared to be in perfect health, preserved like an insect trapped in amber. For 3 days, they watched and waited. The ice showed no signs of melting despite the spring warmth. It was as if the cold that surrounded Tenzin existed, independent of natural temperature, a supernatural winter that followed its own rules. Some of the braver witnesses approached close enough to touch the ice, and they reported that it was so cold it burned their fingers. Yet the air around it remained at normal temperature. On the 3rd day, something changed. The quality of light around the ice began to shift, taking on that same blue glow that had been reported throughout the winter. The chanting, which had continued unabated for 72 hours, began to grow louder and more urgent. And then, impossibly, the ice began to crack. It started as hairline fractures around Tenzin's face, spreading outward like a spider web of silver light. As the cracks spread, a sound emerged from within the ice that witnesses later described as the screaming of winter itself, a sound so cold and terrible that several people fainted from shock. The temperature around the cave plummeted, even as the ice continued to fracture and split. And then, with a sound like thunder, the ice exploded outward in all directions. But instead of the violent destruction one might expect, the fragments simply vanished into nothingness, as if they had never existed at all. Where moments before, there had been a solid block of ice, now there was only Tenzin Norbu, sitting in perfect meditation. His skin flushed with health and warmth. For several long moments, no one dared to move or speak. Then Tenzin opened his eyes, and what the witnesses saw there would haunt them for the rest of their lives. His eyes were no longer human. They had become windows into that frozen hell from their nightmares, swirling with patterns of ice and shadow that seemed to move independently of his gaze. When he looked at someone, they reported feeling as if their soul was being frozen from the inside out. Tenzin stood up with fluid grace, as if he had been resting for minutes rather than months. He brushed imaginary dust from his robes, which appeared completely clean and undamaged despite his ordeal. Then he turned to the crowd of witnesses and spoke, his voice carrying perfectly in the thin mountain air despite the fact that he spoke in barely above a whisper. "I have seen the truth that lies beyond life and death," he said, and his breath came out in clouds of vapor despite the spring warmth. "I have walked in the realm of eternal winter, where time has no meaning and pain has no purpose. And I have learned that death is not an ending, but a doorway to something far more beautiful and terrible than any of you can imagine." The crowd began to back away as Tenzin continued speaking, his words becoming less and less human with each sentence. He described a realm of perpetual ice where consciousness could exist without the burden of flesh, where enlightenment came not through transcendence, but through the complete surrender to cold and emptiness. He spoke of beings made of living ice who had taught him the secrets of survival beyond death, and of a great winter that was coming to cleanse the world of the warmth and chaos of life. But it was what happened next that truly terrified the witnesses. As Tenzin spoke, the air around him began to shimmer with cold. Frost formed on the ground beneath his feet, spreading outward in intricate patterns. The nearby vegetation began to wither and die, not from heat or disease, but from an unnatural cold that seemed to emanate from his very presence. One of the younger monks, overcome by curiosity, or perhaps compelled by some supernatural force, stepped forward and reached out to touch Tenzin's hand. The moment their skin made contact, the young monk's scream echoed across the mountains. His hand instantly turned black with frostbite so severe that the flesh began to crack and split. But more terrifying than the physical damage was the expression on his face. His eyes had taken on the same glassy quality as Tenzin's, and for a moment, witnesses swore they could see that frozen hellscape reflected in his pupils. Tenzin released the young monk's hand and smiled, an expression so cold and inhuman that several witnesses later claimed it was worse than any nightmare they had ever experienced. The young monk collapsed, and though he survived the encounter, he never spoke again. He spent the rest of his life sitting in silent meditation, his eyes vacant and staring, as if his consciousness had been left behind in that realm of eternal winter. Without another word, Tenzin began walking down the mountain path. The crowd parted before him like water, no one daring to get close enough to feel the supernatural cold that surrounded him. As he walked, he left footprints of ice in his wake, each one taking hours to melt despite the spring sun. Vegetation died along his path, and small animals that came too close were found frozen solid, their bodies preserved in perfect detail, but utterly lifeless. The monks from Rongbuk Monastery followed at a safe distance, unsure of what to do. This was their brother, a man they had lived and prayed with for years, but he had become something else entirely. He was no longer bound by the laws of nature, no longer truly alive in any meaningful sense, yet he was not dead either. He existed in some terrible middle ground, a living violation of the boundary between life and death. When they reached the monastery, Tenzin went directly to his cell and began to pack his few belongings. The other monks watched from the doorway, too terrified to enter the room. The temperature inside the cell had dropped to well below freezing, and their breath came out in white puffs as they observed him. Ice crystals had formed on the walls and ceiling, creating beautiful but terrifying patterns that seemed to shift and move when viewed out of the corner of one's eye. "Where will you go?" asked Lobsang Tashi, the head monk, his voice barely above a whisper. Tenzin turned to look at him, and for a moment, Lobsang saw not the face of his student, but something ancient and inhuman, wearing Tenzin's form like a mask. "I go to spread the teaching of eternal winter," Tenzin replied. "There are others who must learn what I have learned, who must walk the path between life and death. The world grows too warm, too alive. It needs the blessing of the cold to find its true purpose." As he spoke, his words began to take on that same inhuman quality that had characterized his chanting. The language was still Tibetan, but the rhythm and inflection were wrong, as if his vocal cords had been replaced by something made of ice and wind. Some of the monks began to pray, not for enlightenment or peace, but for protection from whatever. Their brother had become Tenzin, finished packing, and walked toward the monastery's main gate. As he passed through the courtyard, the prayer wheels began to spin on their own, despite the absence of any wind. But instead of their usual gentle rotation, they spun violently, creating a sound like grinding ice that set everyone's teeth on edge. The prayer flags, which normally fluttered cheerfully in the mountain breeze, hung limp and began to frost over, their bright colors fading to the pale blue-white of deep ice at the gate. Tenzin paused and turned back to address the assembled monks one final time. His voice carried clearly across the courtyard, though he spoke in that same whisper that had somehow grown more terrible than any shout. "Do not mourn for me," he said, "for I have found something greater than life, something more perfect than death. I have become the bridge between worlds, the herald of the winter that will cleanse all things. And when the great cold comes, you will remember this day and understand that I was showing you mercy by leaving while you still have time to prepare your souls for the beautiful terror that awaits us all." With those words, he turned and walked through the gate. The monks watched him descend the mountain path, his figure growing smaller but never less distinct against the snow. Even at a great distance, they could see the frost forming in his footsteps, the way the very air around him seemed to shimmer with unnatural cold. That was the last time anyone from Rongbuk Monastery saw Tenzin Norbu alive, but it was not the last time he was seen. Over the following months and years, reports began to filter in from across Tibet and the surrounding regions. Travelers would speak of encountering a monk on remote mountain paths, a man whose very presence brought winter with him, regardless of the season. Villagers reported sudden, inexplicable cold snaps that would last for days, always preceded by sightings of a figure in maroon robes walking through their streets in the dead of night. Most disturbing were the reports of disciples. In various remote monasteries and hermitages, monks would simply disappear, leaving behind cells filled with ice and the lingering sound of that inhuman chanting. Some were found days later, sitting in meditation in impossible locations, their bodies perfectly preserved by supernatural cold, their eyes reflecting that same frozen hellscape that Tenzin had carried within him. But perhaps the most terrifying reports came from those who claimed to have spoken with Tenzin directly. These encounters always followed the same pattern. A traveler would become lost in a blizzard, only to find shelter in a cave or abandoned building. There they would find Tenzin waiting for them, sitting in perfect meditation, seemingly unaware of their presence. Those brave enough to approach him would find themselves drawn into conversation, though they later struggled to remember exactly what had been said. They spoke of teachings that made perfect sense in the moment, but became incomprehensible horror when recalled in the warmth of civilization. They described visions of a world transformed by eternal winter, where consciousness could exist without the messy complications of flesh and emotion, where peace was found not through enlightenment, but through the complete surrender to cold and emptiness. Some of these travelers never returned to civilization at all. They were found months or years later, sitting in meditation in remote locations, their bodies preserved by the same supernatural cold that surrounded Tenzin. Their faces wore expressions of perfect peace, but their eyes reflected depths of frozen terror that drove some rescuers to madness. The few who did return were forever changed. They spoke of dreams filled with ice and shadow, of feeling perpetually cold no matter how many fires they lit or blankets they wrapped around themselves. Some claimed that Tenzin visited them in these dreams, continuing his terrible teachings, showing them glimpses of that realm of eternal winter where he claimed to have learned his inhuman wisdom. That as the years passed, the stories began to change and multiply. Tenzin was reported in places hundreds of miles apart on the same day. Some claimed he could walk through solid ice as if it were air, others that he could freeze a man's blood with a glance. There were reports of him appearing at the moment of death to those who had devoted their lives to meditation. offering them a choice between the uncertain journey of reincarnation and the uncertainable certainty of his frozen paradise. But the most persistent and disturbing reports suggested that Tenzin was no longer working alone. Witnesses described encounters with multiple figures in monastic robes, all carrying the same supernatural code, all chanting in that same inhuman language. These disciples, if that's what they were, seemed to be gathering in the most remote regions of the Himalayas, preparing for some event that the few survivors of these encounters could only describe as the coming of the Great Winter. The last confirmed sighting of Tenzin Norbu came in 1958, 11 years after his emergence from the ice. A group of mountaineers attempting to climb a previously unscaled peak in the remote Karakoram range reported discovering a cave filled with figures in meditation. At the center sat a man they recognized from descriptions as Tenzin, surrounded by dozens of disciples, all perfectly preserved by the supernatural cold that filled the cavern. The mountaineers reported that all of the figures appeared to be alive, their lips moving in synchronized chanting, their eyes open and aware. But when they tried to communicate with them, the only response was a gradual drop in temperature that forced them to flee before they froze to death. The expedition leader, Hans Kronecker, later wrote in his journal that the chanting seemed to be calling something, summoning some presence that existed in the spaces between ice crystals and the silence between heartbeats. When a rescue expedition returned to the location 6 months later, they found the cave empty except for intricate patterns carved into the ice walls. These patterns seemed to shift and move when viewed directly, creating optical illusions that several members of the rescue team found deeply disturbing. The local guides refused to enter the cave, claiming that the patterns were a map to the realm of the ice spirits, a place where human consciousness could survive the death of the body, but at the cost of everything that made it human. And then, as mysteriously as he had appeared in the modern world, Tenzin Norbu vanished from recorded history. The sightings stopped, the strange cold snaps ceased, and the disappearances of monks from remote monasteries came to an end. It was as if he and his disciples had simply melted away like the spring snow, leaving behind only whispered legends and the lingering fear of those who had encountered them. But the story doesn't end there, because even now, more than 75 years later, there are still reports. Climbers in the highest reaches of the Himalayas speak of hearing that inhuman chanting carried on the wind. Villagers in the most remote valleys occasionally report a night of unnatural cold, accompanied by the sound of footsteps in the snow that leave no tracks. And in the deepest monasteries, where the old ways are still remembered, monks will sometimes wake from meditation to find frost covering their prayer beads and the taste of winter in their mouths. The few scholars who have studied this phenomenon suggest that Tenzin Norbu discovered something that exists at the very edge of human understanding, a practice that allowed him to transcend the normal boundaries between life and death, but at the cost of his humanity. They theorize that he found a way to exist in the quantum space between states of being, neither fully alive nor completely dead, sustained by the same forces that govern the formation of ice crystals and the silence of absolute zero. But perhaps the most disturbing theory comes from the deepest traditions of Tibetan mysticism, the practices so secret and dangerous that they are spoken of only in whispers among the most advanced practitioners. According to these traditions, there are realms of existence that parallel our own, separated by barriers so thin that they can be crossed by those who know the proper techniques. One of these realms is described as a place of eternal winter, where consciousness can exist without form, where thoughts become ice crystals and emotions freeze into beautiful but terrible sculptures of crystallized experience. The texts suggest that Tenzin Norbu found a way to breach the barrier between our world and this realm of eternal winter. But instead of simply visiting it and returning, as the ancient practitioners intended, he brought part of it back with him. He became a living gateway, a point where the two realms intersected, allowing the influence of that frozen hell to seep into our world, like cold seeping through a crack in a window. If this theory is correct, then Tenzin and his disciples may not have disappeared at all, They may simply have learned to exist primarily in that other realm, crossing back into our world only when the conditions are right, when the barriers between realities grow thin enough to allow passage. And if the ancient texts are to be believed, there will come a time when these barriers break down entirely. When the realm of eternal winter finally claims our world entirely, the signs, according to these forbidden texts, will be unmistakable. Winters will grow longer and colder. Spring will come later each year. And people will begin to dream of ice and snow, even in the warmest climates. There will be sightings of figures in monastic robes walking through snowstorms that appear from clear skies. And children will be born with eyes that reflect depths no human gaze should contain. But perhaps most telling of all, the chanting will return. That inhuman rhythm that Tenzin and his disciples perfected will be heard in the wind, in the creaking of ice, in the silence between heartbeats. And those who hear it will feel the terrible pull of that frozen paradise, the promise of consciousness without suffering, of existence without the messy complications of flesh and emotion and mortality. Some say that if you know how to listen, you can hear it even now, on the coldest nights, when the wind carries the scent of snow and the stars seem to burn with the cold light of ice crystals. They say you can hear the faint echo of that ancient chanting, calling to those brave or foolish enough to seek the path that Tenzin Norbu walked all those years ago. The question that haunts scholars and mystics alike is whether Tenzin Norbu was a pioneer who discovered a new form of existence, or whether he was simply the first modern person to stumble upon something ancient and terrible that was always waiting in the spaces between life and death. Was he a master who transcended human limitations? Or was he a victim of forces beyond his understanding, transformed into something inhuman by powers that exist beyond the reach of mortal comprehension? Perhaps we will never know the truth about what happened in that cave during the winter of 1946 and 47. Perhaps the reality is too strange, too terrible for human minds to fully grasp. But one thing is certain: Tenzin Norbu found something in the ice. Something that changed him so fundamentally that he ceased to be human while never quite becoming something else. And somewhere in the highest reaches of the world's tallest mountains, in caves carved from ice that never melts, and silence that never breaks, they say he is still there, still chanting in that inhuman language, still teaching his disciples the terrible truth he discovered in the space between life and death, still waiting for the great winter to come, when the barriers between worlds will finally crumble and his frozen paradise will claim the earth for its own dot. So the next time you find yourself alone in the cold, when the wind sounds almost like voices and the frost on your windows forms patterns that seem too deliberate to be natural, remember the story of Tenzin Norbu. Remember that some boundaries are meant to be respected, some doors are meant to stay closed, and some forms of enlightenment come at a price too terrible to imagine. Because in the end, the most frightening thing about Tenzin Norbu's story is not that he found a way to survive death, it's that he may have found something far worse than dying. He may have found a way to exist forever in the space between life and death. Conscious but not living, aware but not human, eternal but not blessed. And if the old stories are true, if the ancient warnings are more than superstition, then Norbu may still be out there somewhere, walking the boundary between worlds, gathering disciples for the day when winter claims the world forever, the day when we will all learn, too late, exactly what he discovered in that cave of ice and shadow all those years ago.